Video and Film Review is made possible with public funds from the New York State Council on the Arts and by the members of 13.
I was the sort of kid who hung out in Saturday morning museum classes in Cleveland. By the time I emerged from my teens, I'd tried a number of things like painting and so forth. In fact, I know I had, and the results were dreadful. I fancied myself a poet. In any case, in the late 50s, it came over me that neither poetry nor painting were exactly my métier. My academic training was largely in languages and literature. A lot of the criteria of choice for what one will do is based on some kind of appetite or predilection for the sort of idiot work that's involved with a particular discipline. I found the physical procedures of making film, which included a kind of slowness, a kind of distance, a kind of deliberation that doesn't, certainly for film, yield very immediate results to my liking. It very often happens that I film something without having a very clear idea of how I'm going to use it. My work does not come out of a narrative melodrama tradition. It essentially comes out of a documentary tradition, in which within a situation or a set of situations, one makes a great deal of footage and then, as it were, constructs the puzzle afterwards by process of editing. And that very generally, I think, is something that could be said of much of what has been called the new American cinema, which is to say that it traces its antecedents to Vertov, ultimately, to a very great extent, or to Vertov's inheritors, if you will, or to the Lumiere brothers, even earlier on, and the old pâté things and so forth, at the turn of the century in France. The word structural was attached to several bodies of work by a number of filmmakers working at a particular time. It's about a decade ago. The use of that word represents a vigorous and even heroic attempt on the part of one critic and theorist, P. Adam Sidney, to do some sort of justice to and to serve a body of work that had appeared rather suddenly by a group of a dozen people or so, mostly working in New York at that time, not entirely, that nobody had made head or tail of. A group of people at a particular time who shared some common concerns. A dwindling concern with psychology and the notion of personal self-expression, an expanded concern at once with the material of film.
This is the first photograph I ever made with the direct intention of making art. I had bought myself a camera for Christmas in 1958. One day, early in January of 1959, I photographed several drawings by Carl Andre, with whom I shared a cheap apartment on Mulberry Street. One frame of film was left over, and I suggested to Carl that he sit, or rather squat, for a portrait. He insisted that the photograph must incorporate a handsome small picture frame that had been given him a year or so before by a girl named North. How the metronome entered the scheme, I don't recall, but it must have been deliberately. The picture frame reappears in a photograph dated March 1963, but there isn't time to show you that one now. I discarded the metronome eventually, after tolerating its syncopation for quite a while. Carl Andre is 12 years older and more active than he was then. I see less of him nowadays than I should like, but then there are other people of whom I see more than I care to. I despised this photograph for several years, but I could never bring myself to destroy a negative so incriminating.
I began very quickly in photography to work in series rather than the mode of collecting prized single images. As that developed, that interest in the temporal aspect in the timing of looking at things grew to a level of inertia or momentum such that I was finally propelled out of still photography, and pretty much whether I wanted to or not had to start making films. Nostalgia in Greek means the wound of returning. There is presumably some pain involved. I thought, in a way of cauterizing that wound with fire, as a wound is cauterized, just neutralized, so to speak, so that it more or less scars over and heals. When I made that film, I was committing an act of deliberate arson, not on my body of work as a photographer, which was considerably larger than that dozen photographs, and in any case I didn't destroy the negative. But I was more or less incinerating what remained of the persona that had considered itself a still photographer.
The face is my own, or rather, it was my own. As you see, I was thoroughly pleased with myself at the time, presumably for having survived to such ripeness and wisdom since it was my 23rd birthday. I focused the camera, sat on a stool in front of it, and made the exposures by squeezing a rubber bulb with my right foot. There are 11 more photographs on the roll of film, all of comparable grandeur. Some of them exhibit my features in more sensitive or imposing moods. One exposure records what now looks to me like a leer. I sent that one to a very pretty and sensible girl on the occasion of the vernal equinox, a holiday I held in some esteem. I think I wrote her some sort of cryptic note on the back of it. I never heard from her again. Anyhow, photography had obviously caught my fancy. This photograph was made in the studio where I worked. It belonged to the wife of a friend. I dare say they are still married, but he has not been my friend for nearly 10 years. We became estranged on account of an obscure mutual embarrassment that involved a third party and 3 dozen eggs. I take some comfort in realizing that my entire physical body has been replaced more than once since it made this portrait of its face. However, I understand that my central nervous system is an exception. This photograph was made in September of 1960. The window is that of a dusty cabinet maker's shop on the west side of West Broadway, somewhere between Spring Street and West Houston. I first photographed it more than a year earlier as part of a series, but rejected it for reasons having to do with its tastefulness and illusion of deep space. Then, in the course of 2 years, I made a half-dozen more negatives. Each time I found some reason to feel dissatisfied. The negative was too flat, or too harsh, or the framing was too tight. Once a horse was reflected in the glass, although I don't recall seeing that horse. Once I found myself reflected with my camera and tripod. Finally, the cabinet maker closed up shop and moved away. I can't even remember exactly where he was anymore. But a year after that, I happened to compare the prints I made from the 6 negatives. I was astonished. In the midst of my concern for the flaws in my method, the window itself had changed from season to season, far more than my photographs had. I had thought my subject changeless, and my own sensibility pliable, but I was wrong about that. So I chose the one photograph that pleased me most after all, and destroyed the rest. That was years ago. Now I'm sorry. I only wish you could have seen them.
If you attempt to classify images by the first letter of the name of the thing that appears to be depicted, you're immediately in very deep hot water, and it's exactly the kind of hot water that interests me the most. Zorn's Lemma was made over a period of time during which I had undergone a kind of transformation from being an intended poet to someone who dealt very largely in what we can uncomfortably and loosely call visual images. The film had an autobiographical dimension which traced that shift in concentration. Then, years later, I began to learn about something that I consider now enormously exciting, and that, of course, is the split brain hypothesis, as it's called, or the apparent fact that we have not one mind but two. And to put it very crudely, one is concerned with linear and analytic things like language, and another is concerned with non-linear and holistic things like images. And the larger subject of the film finally has to do with the transference of power from one hemisphere of the brain, literally one mind, to another kind of mind entirely.
Where were you? I could have called home. I could have called home, but you called home, but you.
Tell me where you were. Tell me where you were. Tell me where you were. That you couldn't get where you were. That you couldn't get in touch. That you couldn't get in touch.
First film I made that attempted any kind of direct assault on not just sound, which had been there before, but on sync sound, on lip sync in particular, was the film Critical Mass. Most of my films, for a long time, were silent, not because I didn't want to make sound films, but because the problems of sound seemed to me so complex that they were quite beyond my powers. My experience of most sound films was that the sound essentially did nothing. So I wanted to make sound films because, of course, sound is part of film. It's part of its grand problem. But I wanted to do something with sound that would cause the ear to have a kind of full parity with the eye. That concern, that very conscious concern and worry, dates to at least the summer of 1958 when Eisenstein and Pudovkin issued a joint manifesto in which they said that the first really meaningful use of sound would involve its dissynchronization with the image. I was a visiting artist for several days or a week at Binghamton at the university there. I asked around for the names of the two students, a man and a woman, who were at once the most talkative and the most volatile. And I asked them if they would be willing simply to improvise around a scheme that they had been living together for some time, that he had disappeared for a weekend, had returned, and was unable to account for his time. It became quite clear that the crucial issue right within that footage and that sound had to do entirely with time and with synchronization in time. One performer had experienced 3 days or a period of time that the other performer simply couldn't account for at all. And clearly the situation was becoming worse and worse. That is to say that there were a whole set of very fundamental failures of synchronization that were going on there.
Your whole trip is none of my business. Whole trip is none of my business. I don't ever want none of my business. I don't ever want to see it. I don't ever want to see it. You get the hell see it. You get the hell to the apartment. Get the hell to the apartment. Clear the apartment. Clear out your crap. Clear out your crap. Clear out your crap.
I think of Tiger Balm essentially as an erotic film. It was filmed in Kew Gardens, outside of London. Tiger Balm is a legendary Oriental medicine. It's used for, or was used, for prolonging lovemaking. I, at least, have always read Tiger Balm as a kind of prolonged and, I hope, suspended meditation on a kind of vegetative eroticism, which constantly reverts then to the images of children playing off in the distance. And finally, at the climactic moment at the end of the film, there's a quite specific source of spraying and spurting liquid. The entire punctuation of the film is the hyphenated dots of falling fluid, flying through the air, as it were, to fertilize heaven only knows what. what happens in a steel mill? How is it done? Now, I don't certainly attempt to present all of that. It's pretty much looking out as a person would who was within the situation and seeing the object of work, primarily the material, the hot metal, the sparks. Winter Solstice is one of a group of 4 films. The first 3 are Winter Solstice, Autumnal Equinox, Summer Solstice, to run the sequence backwards, were made in a steel mill, or in fact several steel mills, a slaughterhouse, and on a dairy farm. All 3 of them are places where I have myself worked. You had to support yourself some way while you were in school. Slaughterhouses and steel mills in the Midwest were not half bad. I live myself now in a dairy farming area in central New York, and as a child in Ohio, I lived surrounded by exactly the same thing. The things that those 3 films have in common is a notion about the material of painting and the work that constituted the process of painting that has gone by the name of abstract expressionism. So that a given image can have as its pretext sparking incandescent metal, a historical reference to films that were made a half a century ago, when the entire notion of film and of film documentation was being newly explored with very fresh eyes, and as well an homage and a reference to, let us say, Pollock or de Kooning or Klein or Clifford Still or what have you, a generation of artists that were enormously important to me, and I would say to most American artists in my generation.